Yeah, I think Phil is coming. Phil confirmed that he's coming, but let's call to order informally. And Gurjeet, do you want to intro Tamara and outsource? And Tamara, we'll get you going so that we can be mindful of your time, and then we'll do our business.
So if you guys have questions or comments, we were just saying earlier that Tamara, it's hard to hear unless you're like up here. You just either speak really loud or like, come closer. But you guys recall Tamara last year. Well, Chris, you weren't with us.
No,
I don't think you were you?
I remember, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then you're familiar. Helen and I were introduced as chair. Chris is vice chair. Roland used to be. And so we're here again to hear about the AAP and how we get the AAP. It's also published on our website, so you can take a look at it. But Tamara's going to graciously give us her time this evening to go over how she gets those numbers and answer any questions you have. I can't go into all of her degrees, certs, and like all of her experience with this because it's way too much. I'll just let it be known that now she's been in this area doing AAPs for clients that require them, as well as those who do them voluntarily like us. But prior to that, she was an orthopedic surgeon. So if you have any medical questions,
you can tell us all about pre-existing conditions then,
right? I'm a jack of all trades, master of a couple.
At least two very complex ones.
So I usually, for those of you that were with us last year, I do a pretty informal meeting. At the end of each slide, I will pause for a minute just to see if we do have a question. There are no silly questions, so if I use terminology that you may be unfamiliar with, just shout it out. We'll learn together. So, with that being said, so we're going to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future. We're going to look at our results. We're going to talk a little bit about compliant hiring. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it from your perspective as opposed to an implementation person. So some of the things that Gurjeet and I discuss, or I discuss with other clients who are looking at it from an AAP only federal contractor kind of status. We're going to talk a little bit more from a DE&I perspective and then open it up for questions. But like I said, questions are welcome throughout. In the past, this is prior to last year, we would get availability numbers from the 2010 census. Last year, the EEOC did release a 2014 to 2018 census tabulation, they're calling it. There were a few updates to recruiting areas. So in the state of Iowa, where I'm from, where it's very sparsely populated, they did combine some additional counties. So we did see some slight change up in some of the recruiting areas. We did see some SOC codes or occupational codes get changed last year with this new update. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about in the future, some of the things that almost everybody who hires people, whether you're a federal contractor or not, some of the big hiccups that I've seen over the years of being a consultant to HR organizations, dispositioning, recruiting processes, a review of processes, targeted outreach, and then hiring.
Can I ask a question? About the change in the availability data. What did that mean for Arlington? Did that change our number? Did that increase our applicant pools or decrease it?
What it did really is we, like I said, the last census that we were working off before last year was the 2010 census, which took about 4 years to get released. So by having this 2014 to 2018 change, what we did see was a slight increase in certain metropolitan areas, higher increase of minorities, just because we're looking at, 4 to 8 years later. But we also saw with this reorganization, not so much where you are but you will see some fluctuations as the demographics of your recruiting areas may not necessarily be just Arlington, but where you're recruiting from, those substantially changed. In some cases, whether it be due to demographic changes, just, normal progression, or because of that reorganization of MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas. So, in a larger population area, some of those didn't change. In, like I said, in Iowa, I know one area went from 3 counties to 6 counties just because they didn't have enough people to get a good source. So that's a good question. And then the occupational codes do affect that as well. I'll talk about that in a couple slides where how we get your availability numbers. So just a quick overview, what we run for you is a voluntary, but we are running a federally compliant AAP. So that is comprised of a quantitative analysis. We talk about designation of responsibility for the implementation, which is different because you guys are doing a voluntary. Identification of problem areas, action-oriented programs based on those problem areas or areas that may occur just through the progression of the year. And then, the big one for everyone, federal contractor or not, documentation.
And Tamara, on the federally compliant point, we're using the OFCCP standard as opposed to standard applicable to federal agencies.
That would be correct, yes, OFCCP. So the availability, one of the two main things that we talk about when we give results are under areas of underutilization, where our recruiting areas are showing that we have more females or minorities than what we have in our incumbency. And then the other is disparity or adverse impact, where it may, based on numbers. All of this is based on numbers. It may look like we have some disparity in our hiring practices against minorities or females in terminating or promoting. So we're looking at the 3 main movement areas within your workforce: hiring, terminating, and promoting. So when we talk about availability or where your underutilization goals come from, we're talking about your availability. So in this case, we're looking at your job group 1.11, which is your assistant county manager, chief environmental officers. 95% of the time, we would recruit from the outside. So this level 1 here is taking the information from the census information, the new census information. But we've also assigned SOC codes or SOC codes to every job title. So we're not just looking at the gross numbers from the census, we're actually drilling down even deeper into occupational codes. So let's take a look at minority numbers. So according to the census, and this is looking at occupational codes, we have a 21.8% minority availability. We multiply that times 95% and we get a weighted availability of 20.71. Internally, we would promote from within 5% of the time from the 1.21 job group. Our availability there for minorities is 33.33, multiplied times 5 gives us 1.67. We then add the external to the internal to get a weighted availability. This is our total weighted availability. So in a perfect world, absent discrimination, over time, we should have a representation of 22.38% of our workforce in this job group be minority. So when we talk about underutilization goals, we did have a few this year. So one of them was in the job group 610. And to help, these are some of the job titles that fall within that job group. So we know we have goals. We're underutilized in females. And I'm sure if you take a look at some of these job titles, you would say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I don't care if you're Arlington County or if you're a co-op in Washington State, when you start looking at the sixes, the operatives, within any organization, we're almost always short of females in this job group. So how do we fix that? And this is where that over time, our workforce will represent where we're recruiting from. We need to do targeted, meaningful outreach. It isn't enough just to post your jobs on Monster or Indeed and cross your fingers and hope. The government expects you, the OFCCP expects you to do targeted outreach within your local community where you're recruiting from. And in this case, for operatives, it's typically where you would be in Arlington County or neighboring counties. Reach out to your community college, tech schools. Since we have a lot of tech positions here, reach out to your tech schools. Develop a partnership with them so that when we do have availability, we can send our jobs to them. Go to job fairs, develop these relationships. Technology colleges. One that I looked up within your area would be the wider opportunities for women. Now, this is their home base. They may or may not have a location within your area, but according to what I read, Mid-Atlantic region. So you should have support there. Have somebody within your talent acquisition team reach out to this organization, find out who supports your area, and have them develop these partnerships. Marketing. You're going to hear me talk a lot about marketing, internal marketing, external marketing. Marketing Arlington County as a preferred employer. Why should people come and work for us? Another area we were underutilized was minorities within the 913 job group, and these are our upper level law enforcement. So here we have another option or opportunity.
Can I interrupt you for a second? You said that's upper level law enforcement. The fourth one says police officer. That's not like a regular line police officer.
No, I'm sorry. This would be your law enforcement. 913 is your law enforcement. But within this one job group, we have lines of progression. So we would go from here to probably the corporal. I'm saying officer, probably corporal, then sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. We have clear lines of progression. So number one, we need to make sure that we are doing targeted, meaningful outreach for minorities at the entry level so that by the time we do get up to lieutenants and captains, we do have a minority presence that are there for availability for promotion.
Would that category also include the sheriff's office or just the police?
I believe the sheriff's office is in its own job category. I'd have to go back and take a look at your data, but I do believe that is in a separate one.
They're constitutional, so we have data with and then without that's run.
Yeah, we do run a with constitutionals and without. So, some examples of targeted outreach: Fraternal Order of Police, Small and Rural Enforcement Executives Association, National Association of Police Organizations, and then, like I said, the internal makeup of the feeder groups. Feeder group being this would serve what we call feed itself. We promote from within the same job group. So now we're going to talk a little bit about adverse impact, and it's the result of inequity in any personnel activity. And that's, like I said, hiring, terminating, or promoting. When the rate of selection for women or minorities is less than 80% of the selection rate for men or non-minorities. And it is typically the greatest potential liability. From a federal OFCCP standpoint, there's a lot of liability there as far as they can't bid on contracts. Your liability would be different. But it's where we see the biggest liability issues. And 9 times out of 10, it isn't because we've done anything wrong in our selection process. We have not documented our processes well enough. Either we don't have definitive processes, they aren't being followed, or we're not documenting why certain applicants weren't selected.
And Tamara, the question around documentation, I know you've been with the county now, this is the second year, right? Or third year?
No, third year. I think we're going into we would be going into, I think, our fourth.
So then from a tracking perspective, like you had that WOW organization on the technical job code.
Yep.
Part of your kind of year over year tracking, is there any mechanism to evaluate whether in fact the county did engage in more meaningful targeted outreach, and then what the corresponding increases are on the placement rates?
So I would be happy to analyze those. That's a manual process. It has never been sent to me, but yes, as part of the federal compliant requirements, federal contractors have to do an analysis. So they have to write down what their targeted outreach was, how many applicants came from that source, and then how many hires we had. So year over year, we should be evaluating, are we wasting our time sending jobs to XYZ university because we aren't getting any qualified applicants? Or should we divert our attention and energies towards, these new ones? Year over year, since 2014, federal contractors have to do disability and self-IDs for race, gender, and veteran status. Year over year, veteran status and individuals with disabilities has always been low for a multitude of reasons, but we still have them do targeted outreach just because the more people see these self-ID forms, the more apt they are to fill them out. I would be happy. It should be your applicant tracking people, talent acquisition, HR maybe tracking that information. But yes, they should be doing an analysis every year on the effectiveness of the outreach that they're doing based on those areas of underutilization.
And I know we talked at the outset that there's a difference between the OFCCP covered federal contractors that must do this, and then the category of employers that are doing it on a voluntary basis. Do you see voluntary employers doing that tracking year over year as well?
Yes, ma'am. About a year after, maybe 2 years, about a year after we started working with you, I started working with a state, and we have every department and division within this state doing a voluntary AAP, and they're actually passing legislation within the state to make it mandatory that they have to do this analysis. You're wasting man hours, time, and money. Number one, by not doing the outreach, you're not diversifying your applicants. Number two, you're wasting time and money if you don't do the analysis. And that's one of the areas, the reason we call the OFCCP kind of the gold standard, extremely high, not just recommendations or best practices, but requirements in order to safeguard the government's money. So do the targeted outreach, diversify. If you keep fishing from the same pond, you're going to keep getting the same fish. Diversify those pools. So we're going to talk a little bit now about adverse impact. And once again, I cannot stress it enough. We are only looking at numbers, okay? I'm old enough to know Paul Harvey. I don't know if anybody else is. In an audit situation, that's when we would tell the rest of the story. Based on numbers, we do have some areas of adverse impact in new hires for minorities in these two job groups, and we'll go a little bit more in depth what those are. Minorities in one job group, and this is for promotions. New hires for males in the law enforcement, that 913, and then terminations for non-minorities. So when we look at adverse impact, we'll go across 2-2. These are your professionals. And this is kind of the breakdown. We had 1,566 white applicants. Now, another part of record keeping is dispositions. I had talked about the disposition codes. This is why an applicant falls out of the hiring process. Did a more qualified applicant get hired due to education, due to experience, whatever? Based on those dispositions, sometimes we can eliminate applicants because they don't meet what we call the definition of an internet applicant. So we're trying to only do an analysis on people who truly were going through the hiring process. So we had 1,566 white applicants. We had 49 hires. We had 2,402 minority applicants, and we hired 41. The white rate of hire was 3.13 versus 1.71. So adverse, we were off 2.96 standard deviations. Minorities were adversely impacted, roughly 13 people. But we had 123 people who did not identify a race. So then you have to go, okay, 123 people, we had 13 people that were affected. And what we're seeing is roughly 7 to 10% of applicants elect not to self-ID their race. It's slightly lower for gender because most people feel, well, my name is Tamara. They're going to know on my application that I'm a female. I'll give them my gender, but I'm not going to give them my race. So are you within the statistical probability that these were possibly minorities that just chose not to identify? Yes. In this case, though, 5-9, which is administrative, 2-2 is your professionals, 5-9 is your administrative, 618 versus, and we had 20 hires, 2,254 minority applicants. Do you already see an issue here where we have 4 times as many minorities applicants as non-minorities, but we only hired 10 more? So minority rate of hire was 1.33 versus 3.24 versus 1.33. Minorities were affected, roughly 9.2 people. We only had 50 that didn't identify. So if there was quote unquote homework, and I do like to assign homework, you can ask Gurjeet, I would take a look at this job group specifically and say, okay, let's take a look at these applicants. Why do we have disparity here? Even though we had 4 times as many, why is there such a huge gap in the numbers here? And then can we justify the hires that we made? Like I said, in an audit situation, we would have to turn over all of the applications and the auditor would go through and make that discernment. Because you're doing an elective AAP, there's no reason why you shouldn't be held, in my opinion, to that same level. Let's take a look at all of these applicants. Let's look at those disposition codes. If we were to do a self-audit, Could we justify the hires that we made within these job groups? Part of it could be, once again, record keeping. Part of it could be process, somebody diverted from the process. Are we making sure that every applicant is going through the same hiring process for the same job title? That's also a problem. When we look at gender, once again, now we're looking at applicants again. In the 9/12s, we had 593 male applicants, we hired 25. 129 females, we hired 2. Male rate of hire 4.22 versus 1.55 for females. Sorry, I was in the wrong line. 9/13, it's late. 375 males, 19 hires. 105 females, 11 hires. Male rate of hire 5.7, 10.48. Males were adversely impacted, roughly 4 people. Now, we did have 22 that chose not to identify. So we look at everybody, not just females, minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. If we see any disparity in any of your hiring, we tag it.
I'm sorry, is that the law enforcement?
Yep, 9/13.
So did you start to do any look behind the curtain with that one? For instance, is it possible that the women that applied to law enforcement were self-selecting as better candidates before going in the door?
I
So-
have not, but I would be more than happy to. That's that next level.
I mean,
Working,
I understand how the statistical analysis works, but at the end of the day, there were way more men being hired and there were way more men on the force. So that one in particular, maybe there's some sort of affirmative action being taken for less qualified women for the same position. Maybe that's a possibility, but it's not like they're getting 50% of the appointments, and in fact, they should be getting like 70% of the appointments for new slots, and yet because of what the force looks like, and yet because it's a smaller percentage under this analysis for men, that's actually being seen as a negative under this analysis, I think.
exactly. The other problem that I've seen, especially in law enforcement and some manufacturing positions with other clients, is that we have one set of physical standards for males and one for females. And they're not being updated regularly or revised or match a national norm. That has caused problems in some of my universities that I work with that are also doing voluntary in their law enforcement. One university that I worked with had not updated their physical standards from the early 70s.
Tamara, one quick question. What's the period covered by your data?
This is through the end of June last year. You guys are on a July 1st year, so we will be doing a new one, hopefully starting next month.
So it's the end of June 2022.
Correct.
And the reason why I brought that up is the police department just put out its annual report. I mean, it just came out, I think, today, maybe in the last day or so. And if you look at the statistics there, they seem to be better than what you're showing right now, so far as recruitment and indeed hiring of minorities and women.
But for
And
this,
Yeah, like I said, you guys are on a July 1st plan year. As soon as we get your data, we have your reports turned around usually within 2 to 3 weeks. Then we have to do the narrative, which we've streamlined that process, Gurjeet and I, over the years to make it, because you guys have a very specific narrative, because you're not a federal contractor. So we should hopefully, depending on when we get your data from the HR department, I'm hoping, we have it by the end of July so that hopefully we can get this turned around and have new results by August, September.
And one of the hurdles that in the past has existed in the hiring of police officers is the education requirement. Were you, in reviewing all of the data, do you still see the education requirement as any sort of impediment?
To be honest, I don't ever see that as a part of the data that is submitted by HR. A lot of the questions that you're asking, I work directly with Gurjeet, not HR, and maybe Gurjeet can go a little bit deeper into that area.
As far as the process, Roland, I don't know if this is probably not gonna answer your question. Feel free to repeat it so I can understand what you're saying. But all the data goes directly from HR encrypted to Tamara. I don't see it. As far as the degrees, I think a long time ago, Tamara, when we first started working with you, we had talked about like background and education and how are people being picked and degrees. And I think one of the challenges there at that time, we were told by HR was that a lot of this was paper, all in paper files. It'll be going through and looking through who had the degree and all. That's what I recollect. So I don't know if they're not getting the degree information. I imagine that's why, because it's not in a format that they can send it over to you. But we're happy to check on any specific question on that with HR and get back to you.
Well, and I think maybe expect, because I remember last year there were, I think, reasonable follow-up questions around practices and that are completely unrelated to the analysis, that are related to HR practices in the county. And so I think it would be interesting, whether in this cycle or a future cycle, actually have relevant HR components. Because I know the police department's in-house there. And there's, I think, systems division or whatever they call it. But I would love, I don't think it's Tamara's responsibility, part of her contract, to do some of the deep dive on like why has this happened, so much as that it is happening. And I think it would be useful to hear from the HR department and the reaction to the findings, and maybe to help us understand what might be happening in these categories. Because in Tamara's case, I know there's only so much data that you receive, and it's not even your office's responsibility to provide some responses to some of the data. I would love to see that, or I'd love to have that happen, or at least make the offer. They can
Well, and there has been a slight kind of disconnect from HR. Some of the deeper dives that I typically, when I see a problem area that I have discussions with my other clients, I am able to go a little bit deeper, or at least ask the questions, hey, let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at this. Well, this is a good example here, terminations. So we're just solely looking at numbers here. We had 66 white employees, 13 terminations, 49 minority employees, 3 terminations. Non-minorities appears to be adversely impacted. But when we're talking about terminations, the analysis is looking at voluntary and involuntary. So this is where I'd go back to my contact, who is, typically VP of HR. And I would say, okay, now I need you to go back and take a look at your terminations and tell me, were they voluntary or involuntary? If they were voluntary, then we just eliminated that adverse impact. And that's when we would have another discussion about Are we doing stay interviews? Are we doing, you know, mid-year, or do we have an opportunity for our current employees to tell us, you know, changes that they'd like to see or have input, you know, so that we can correct the problem before our employees leave. So, you know, there are things that best practices that we can discussions we can have. And I'm going to recommend something at the end of this presentation that may help our current situation so that you could better utilize me. Adverse impact and promotions, you know, by now you know how to read the lines in this job group. We're looking at these people. 99 white employees, wrong line, 171 employees. We had 10 promotions, 289 minorities. We had 2 promotions. So the white rate of promotion over minorities were adversely impacted. So this is where I would have the discussion, okay, promotions, what are we using as the description of promotion? Federally, they say it's a change in a job title and an increase in pay. But are we talking when we do a deeper dive, are they competitive? Are they non-competitive? Were they step promotions? You know, all of these are the rest of the story that the numbers don't tell. If these were all competitive, then yeah, we would need to take a look at our promotion process and make sure that it is uniform for all of these job titles, and these are just a few within this job group.
And Tamara, just I want to make sure I'm tracking what you've just articulated on the termination side, voluntary versus involuntary, and then getting behind how we're defining promotions. That's a step you could take, but haven't yet taken.
Yeah.
Is it part of your contract with the
It
county? Or is that?
It can be. So I have some clients that I work on projects with them throughout the whole year. And then I have others that just give me an AAP.
But our
and-
contract with you is that it's give me an AAP, and we have not contracted with you guys to do.
Nope.
Guys.
Your
Yeah.
contract is I'm 24/7, well, not 24/7, but 40 hours a week I'm available to work with your organization.
So that means we've already paid for that?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
not adding an additional extension to this.
Nope.
Something we could do, and we're underutilizing.
But is it fair to say you would need human resources to cooperate with providing you additional information in order to do the deeper analysis?
That would be correct, yeah.
I had a question from the last slide. Can you say again, voluntary termination is actually somebody quitting?
Voluntary termination, yes, that is somebody quitting.
No, I've never heard that term.
Yeah, it's so I used to work for a government contractor, and it's just a bit like, yeah, it's termination is just the end of employment, but it can be you choose to or you've been fired. It's a dumb.
But if you don't take, I mean, without that distinction, this issue is irrelevant almost.
Totally.
But then you, like we did, we at my organization, we tagged every type of termination because we were a contractor, so we knew that we would want to be able to answer the question: was this someone who resigned, or was it someone who was laid off, let go, or fired for cause? But that's you know that was one step into our HR system.
Yeah.
You had to go.
And several of my clients do provide me that information. So we run the analysis as an combined, and then we come back and say, but I've looked at your data and you had five, in this case, non-minority or white employees who voluntarily quit. So while the data is showing us one thing, when we look at the reasons behind the terminations, we can see that we had 5 voluntaries, and the analysis is showing that we had 3.8 people that were affected. 5 is greater than 3.8, so we know that we just eliminated on paper by telling the rest of the story, that adverse impact or disparity.
Is one recommendation for next year on this point actually to get the specific data on voluntary versus involuntary? Is that something that we could?
We put it on the data template. As much information as you can provide, the more helpful our recommendations will be. So the reports are one thing, but then we give our follow-up recommendations.
So
Or
you're asking, sorry.
yeah.
You're
Yeah.
asking for it, or at least you're providing an opportunity for it to be provided to you, and the choice is being made not to provide it.
That would-
Not
that would be- yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about changing who we are. Strategic partnerships. Once again, that goes back to that targeted outreach. Everybody, in my opinion, from your hiring managers to your brand new employee that started today, is an opportunity for us to network in the community, organizations, and that's part of that whole, let's be an employer of choice. External marketing, employer of choice campaigns, feature your employees in newsletters. Anything you do within the community makes you an employer of choice. And there's a lot of opportunities from day one of, well, actually it starts from the application process. A lot of how people feel about working at your organization starts from their first experience, and that starts as an applicant. Day one, what are we doing to make our people feel welcome? Which also in turn reflects in our terminations. We may reduce our turnover if people just feel welcomed. Can they come to work as themselves? And, so one of the things I like to recommend is mentors. Do we have mentors assigned to our new employees? And they do not necessarily have to be within the same division or department. Are we assigning them a friend, a buddy, somebody that they can learn the ins and outs of working for Arlington County, not necessarily just within their own job? Internal initiatives, DE&I steering committee. I really believe that having a DE&I steering committee that works with Gurjeet's office, HR, the different departments, we could make some of these changes that we could really put some momentum behind our efforts. ERG groups, helping with that educational campaign. I have had about 30 clients who have started ERG groups or supported ERG groups solely on disability. And we are seeing a huge uptick in acceptance in the workplace. There's open discussions about disabilities. Their turnover has gone down. They're diversifying their workforce and their applicant pools just because people feel comfortable discussing things. Disability awareness, internal marketing campaigns on DE&I subjects. That can be anything from, your internal newsletters to, once again, counting on your ERG groups to help your group to get the message out across all of Arlington County. We see silos in manufacturing. We really see silos within government entities. Colleges are another one where we have some serious silos, and it's hard to get everybody to work and pull together. So if I had one big push or recommendation, it would be, let's develop a DEI steering committee. Maybe it starts with you guys, but let's start a internal group that can really start influencing everyone. Everyone. I know people are worried about, keeping their place, but if we're going to make a difference and change who we are, we need to all work together. Inconsistent hiring processes, unconscious bias, and consistent documentation. These are things that I harp on every year. It happens with every client. Doing training isn't enough. And this is where training your hiring managers about the processes, reviewing our processes, unconscious bias training. We have it, but how are we, where do they, what do we do with it once they leave that training room? Are we doing any kind of follow-up? And this is where having a committee or, more manpower to focus on how is law enforcement's post-training follow-up on unconscious bias the same as our maintenance or roads committees? I do a lot of training in my local community, with our town on unconscious bias. And I train them all at the same time, from the from the town administrator to our brand new waste management crews. Everybody is in there, and we have some very open and sometimes harsh discussions on implicit bias or unconscious bias in the workplace. But we've seen a change. We've really seen a change.
Tamara, when you say, training isn't enough and it's the follow-up where the change is happening, like what does that follow-up look like to you? I hear your point about consistency. Everybody is getting the same degree of follow-up, but what actually is it?
So one of the things that I've done in the town of Mount Pleasant is, once they've all sat in on my training, I do a follow-up email, a couple months later to everyone, because everyone has a town email address. I give them approximately 7 days. They're notified beforehand that they should be receiving my email. And have you seen any examples of implicit bias or unconscious bias or harassment in the workplace that you would like to let me know? And all the emails go to me and to the HR person. And they're well aware of this. They went from having very, very few people respond to anything. The only way that they found out was maybe through a complaint, a formal complaint. Now we're heading things off ahead of time, and they're able to share their concerns, but in an open format. The other thing that we're seeing, though, are recommendations. And to me, that is, once again, all of the employees of our town working together to make it a better place to work, to make it so that people don't want to leave, that people do want to work here, even though they could cross a bridge and make more money if they went to work for Charleston town as opposed to town of Mount Pleasant. We're seeing people work together, want to stay, want to make their workplace more inviting to people, and we're not seeing our turnover that we were seeing before.
When you say about the recommendations, are you saying as part of that email, in addition to inviting people to come forward on whether they perceived unconscious bias or harassment, also in recommendations to make the workplace better?
Yes, ma'am. And then, so I do a follow-up 2 months after my training. The county or the town has an open forum. They've put boxes in every location that people check in, whether they're hourly or, exempt, that they can put in recommendations there. The other thing that we've started implementing, even though we're a relatively small town, I can't tell you, I think there's maybe 1,500 people that work for our town, full and part-time, is we started implementing feedback for your peers. So you can call out a peer anonymously, and they get anything from an afternoon off to a gift card to, there's a wide variety of things, but you can, basically you're saying thank you And then it is acknowledged throughout the whole town that they post it on Nextdoor, they put it on Facebook, they put it on the website, county web or town website, that this person has been recognized. So these recognition programs are really helping too. Instead of just being an employee, you're part of a family. There's 15, 20 different things that I've done over the years as we've grown. Now I've been working with the town for 5 years, and I'm very proud of the advancement that they've done. And it doesn't matter who's sitting in the town administrator's chair. Um, Elections come and go, but the feeling is still there.
And
And
these recommendations that you're talking about, things that you can do to actually more substantially combat unconscious bias, have you conveyed those to Arlington as part of your
so,
work?
yeah, some of them, Gurjeet and I discussed different things. Yeah. So some of these are things that we could work. But it needs to be not just from, we need multiple silos, in my opinion.
I'm guessing not sufficient for just the Human Rights Office to advocate for these
Yeah,
changes and policies. It needs to be an all government approach.
yeah, yeah. We need people from all of the departments to be there. For the first couple unconscious bias trainings that I gave, and I focus on different things. And that training is available also to you. Um, we focused on different things, and the first couple times we may have had 50%. In our town actually pays the employee to come to sit in training.
In addition to wages, you mean like there's an extra bump to go?
They get $1. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but they get $1 and they do not have to go to their job. They're going to the mandatory training. The courtroom that we hold the trainings in only holds 400 people. So I've had to start doing it multi-days because now we're full. Once I made it mandatory that the administrator be there, the mayor and a couple other C-suite people, the conversation started opening up, but it was done in a healthy way. It was not done in a complaint way or a negative way. Um, they were very healthy discussions, things that needed to be said, the hard things that needed to be said. And as a group, we came to some resolutions on some things. So open communication, going back to this steering committee, having a group of people, and now we have one here, that's kind of setting the goals. What are our quarterly goals? What are our annual goals? What are our biannual goals? Um, and then tagging ERG groups to help with these campaigns. It takes a lot of people to make an effective change. We cannot have silos. And unfortunately, I saw a lot of silos here. Our law enforcement were not attending. The last 3 trainings I've done there, they attended not only just the our police department, but the police academy virtually. They had the feed streamed to them virtually. So we have everybody now from, like I said, our parks people to the mayor to all of our law enforcement and fire departments
Are you
and
talking about
police
Arlington or your town?
for my town.
Okay.
I would
And-
love to do it for Arlington. Love to.
You mentioned that your unconscious bias training is available, again, part of the contract, like your 40 hours a week availability. Has anybody scheduled you to do that? for the very?
No, that would not be included with the contract.
We actually have that in the county. We have implicit bias, I think, and unconscious bias training. It's rolled out, and if I recall correctly, it's mandatory for all. So HR can definitely, confirm that. But yeah, that's probably why we haven't contracted, or HR hasn't contracted with the company, because they already have a vendor or do it in-house.
Yeah. And that's great. And recommendations, those are things that I can share willingly. I mean, there's a lot of things. Gurjeet, if you can just make a list and let me know, and I'll send you some of these things.
Yeah.
But these are all opportunities for growth.
Yeah, I think one of the main ones Tamara had recommended that we have in the AAP currently is having OHR and HR, and maybe, member employees, like for maybe some members of ERGs, do a DEI steering committee. So employees on the DEI steering committee coming up with like strategies of what may work in their departments. That was one of the things that we had talked about.
And that's basically the end of my presentation. Yeah, you contract with us to do your AAP, but you also get my consulting for your, unlimited consulting.
Tamara, this has been so helpful. Thank you for taking us through the data and all of these really interesting recommendations that you have. I think there probably will be follow-up. Are there further questions in the room for Tamara? Thank you so much. You're back to your night, and we've got you in under an hour.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, do we want to do a discussion on that and what we heard? I mean, I was taking some pretty copious notes here. And Chris, I mean, part of it we could push through the committee, or we could discuss it here.
I think we should discuss here, only
Yeah.
because I think we still have some work to do. We have to chat about the committee, but I mean, I certainly think that one of the follow-ups that I would appreciate, and maybe it's actually taking a step back from just like responding to the report, but what I mentioned earlier about just hearing from human resources on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and its hiring outreach programs. And I think that would be a helpful starting point for, I think, getting a broader set of discussions around what this follow-on initiatives and efforts may look like. I mean, certainly the county has made a significant amount of effort respect to sort of having our chief race officer, chief race and equity officer, and certainly has put a significant emphasis on that in terms of county processes and working with county community groups. So I'm confident that Arlington has a commitment, but I do think when it comes to the application of that commitment and hiring processes in departments across the county, that better coordination could be really helpful through some type of DEI.
So we're actually doing some of that. We've been doing more of it on our websites, I think. And as far as some of the things that Tamara talked about, the ERGs, I think we've got like 9 or 11 of them now. I forget how many. And also, I know Marcy sent me a list of items that HR had done too in different initiatives, for example, the barrier analysis work.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the chief race and equity officers work, you're right. It's been a lot in the community. I think one of the challenges that we have to remember when we're doing the AAP internally, though, is that the distinction between the equity work and the EO work, right? Because if you're using the GARE framework with those questions, you can't really use that internally for hiring and personnel practices, because it went into preference based on race, actually, right? So there's that. But I think what you're saying is you'd like to hear more, if I'm correct, about just what some of the HR initiatives are, the follow-up is, in just the general umbrella of DE&I work and initiatives in the county for employees and applicants, and how we're coordinating. So we coordinate on a monthly basis, HR, Samia's office, and us, on some of the racial equity work, and then also the DE&I work. And we actually just did HR led the effort in doing a nice little kind of like a Venn diagram to try to explain to people, because as you can imagine, folks that are new to this don't understand the different areas and how they overlap. To explain to employees how this work is being done. We just rolled out EEO training, refresher training for all of our employees. Made it mandatory through a county email that went out from Mark, our county manager, to say everyone needs to reset. That was done a few months ago. We're now starting a refresher training that we're planning, as well as a manager training. So a lot's actually being done. I think sometimes our challenges, we don't communicate it out well. So we can definitely touch base with HR and say, I don't know if you guys, I'm not sure what I'm hearing is an invitation.
I think so, and I
Okay.
think July would probably be good, off and on.
So you're looking for that for the commission as a whole, but standing.
I think for the commission as a whole, right, because I think some of the points that Gurjeet is raising would be helpful more broadly to hear from folks. And then I think from a broader commission perspective, what I've sort of distilled down what I heard tonight are a couple of things that I think we're going to have to do this now. I think we have to hearing from HR what they're doing. But I think there are opportunities to better collaborate with the vendor on parsing the data so that we can get behind some of the concerns we have here. And I was concerned that we're not actually tracking our targeted and meaningful outreach, right? Which is part of her recommendation as well. I want to make sure that we're capturing that. And then I think getting a readout on the DE&I steering committee and the ERG. Talked about that in a lot of other contexts.
ERG employee relation group.
Employees like AHA, Asian American,
Affinity group, affinity groups used to,
Right.
term that was used, but I think we transitioned away.
So one of the concerns I have is, I think we want a workforce that looks like Arlington, looks like the broader community, and that maybe we can't do this, but the job categories where there is a disproportionate number of white men and fewer women or fewer minorities, which inherently seems to be like a bad thing. But if you hire in greater proportion than whatever the starting percentage is, then it's going to be dinged the next year as being inappropriate under this data.
Yeah.
And that was why, like, police force, a lot of white men, but even though more white men are being hired, they're not as hired as the same percentage as the applicant with this. And that seems problematic to me. Like, you're never going to make progress. I guess the only way to do this is fill the number, regardless of the number of people who get hired, fill the number of people applying with people who are not white men, and then maybe you'll make progress, because then you can take a larger percentage of the time. But it seems counterintuitive for what I think we're trying to achieve.
Then I think you got to overlay that with the concept that what you can do under any affirmative action plan and under laws, you cannot hire a less qualified applicant because they are in a particular protected class that will help the demographic stats get better.
Right.
That's
You can hire, though, can't you hire people who are well qualified who actually can use other experiences though?
Oh, for sure, right? I mean, we're looking at, you've got to pick from apples to apples. So you can't say, actually, in this instance, white male is the more qualified applicant. We want to increase the number of women police officers, so we're going to go ahead and hire that person, right? Because we would have deviated from the basic laws there. So I think, and love your thoughts, I think the way that we have to do it, the hiring at least has to because remember, the metric was on the new hires.
Yeah.
So I think it's got to correct it going forward. And so long as our basic qualifications were valid, and we see that there is a disproportionate adverse impact in a way that actually helps our statistics, but we're comfortable with our hiring decisions, that they were valid, like pick your risk, right? And I think you're right, that's a better risk to have.
The other thing that I noticed is I don't think that there is a legal reason why we make a distinction between constitutional officers and non-constitutional. They're county employees. Maybe there's a distinction between the schools and everybody else. But like if you're talking about law enforcement, to me, it makes no, there's a difference between a jailer and a sheriff who's out and about. But the sheriffs who are basically being active law enforcement in the community should be in the same category as police officers, I think. And I don't know why.
My understanding though is that there's two versions of the data with constitutionals.
Yeah, she
Actually, it's integrated.
I think there's just two versions of the data.
So I think if the question is why aren't we, why isn't the AAP that we publish including constitutional? But the data is run two different ways. One is just with employees, county employees. Constitutionals can be a bit more complicated. Some are county employees, some are not. But their data is run and it does, we have a separate set of data. In fact, she had slides on that. And on the AAP, I think the important to remember is we're looking at not necessarily the makeup of Arlington County. You're looking at the relevant labor, qualified labor pool of the position, job county you're applying for. So if we're getting our police corporals from Chicago and we're hiring 50% of them from Chicago, and Chicago happens to be 50% Hispanic, that's the relevant market we're looking for. Then 50% we're internally hiring. That's an entirely separate question whether we should be looking at Chicago to begin with, which I think one of the things that might get to that is if you're doing your targeted meaningful outreach, for example, to one of those organizations you mentioned, maybe that would change where you're recruiting from and then therefore change your analysis. But the analysis isn't, let's look at Arlington County, let's look at the demographics. And I make this a point of this because, we have the dashboard, we have other things going on. So if you look at Arlington County and you say we have 50% of this, 50% of that, keep into account that 50% is kids, high school students, teachers, police officers, you have to have qualified labor pool from which you're recruiting from. That's what you're looking at. But I see your broader point about the differences in some of your concerns. So we can definitely find out why we didn't include sheriff in constitutional at the outset. I remember having a conversation 4 years ago, but she does run it, and her slides after this actually had that data.
So do you go to the sheriff with that? I mean, with her recommendation? Because in the past, we have not asserted jurisdiction. And I must admit, I don't know whether it's in the statute, I can read the statute, over those constitutional officers, because they are elected independently of the county board members. The sheriff is elected independently, the court is elected independently, the treasurer, they're all elected by the people, a different political entities. But in the past, whenever we, and this was the EO, has asked any one of those constitutional officers, and how I can speak for this also, they've always come. They've always opened their books. They've always presented. So I don't think there's going to be any hesitation on their part if anyone here wants to talk to them and see pretty much what they do. But in the past, we have not.
I mean,
asserted. That doesn't mean you shouldn't,
Yeah.
but in the past, we have not.
theory, Mark doesn't control the office of the constitutional officer. I understand that.
Right.
But in terms of the data and the recommendations, somebody could say and maybe it's done this way. Law enforcement the groups are either same hiring practices where they're not. And the recommendations might be the same thing, but in terms of presentation of data, it makes sense for it to be integrated to the extent possible.
But they're different. I see where you're coming from. They're different. And they have different people in charge. But
Right.
the police chief does not in any way feel obligated to report or to deal with anything to hire anything with the sheriff's office, vice versa.
Yeah, but if the sheriff's office has 50% more females
Mhm.
or minorities or whatever than the police officer, then that actually tells us something. I don't know exactly what it
Oh, yeah,
does.
it does.
But
And I think you will find out, at least we found out in the past, that when we brought in constitutional officers and had them do presentation, they were very, very impressive. I mean, some of the things that they do, extremely impressive. For example, when Ingrid Malloy was Commissioner of Revenue, put together some incredible programs that she brought in people heretofore who were not part of the hiring process. She brought in. When you talk to the sheriff's office, because it was big, did an impressive amount of hiring and put them in high positions. That's not the same thing as pretty much what happened over here with Arlington. But they did it because it was their shop. They called the shots. They set up the standards. You're right in the sense, yeah, they could help. But they have done, because when you look at what they've done something.
I mean, I think a key distinction, though, is that I wouldn't say it's easier for constitutionals to direct human resources practices. But I imagine if you're the sheriff and the department's HR component works for you and you set priorities, that's a bit different than I think the diverse number of departments. Also, even though there's Mark, you still have a board that has to prioritize. Not to say that they deserve credit for that work, but I also recognize that the scale of the county's operations and personnel make it really important that it's not just Mark saying this is important or the board saying it's important, but ensuring that the folks that are making hiring decisions. I think it's unfair to say, I think research support this, that we have a tendency to hire people who have the same similar back or similar to us, whether that means education levels and gender and race, the pipeline. I mean, when you think about police departments, the progressive nature of it, it's the beginning. It sort of sets the stage, the pipeline, the initial police. I think it's police officer to corporal and onward, right. But you sort of think about how much of diversity of the department is baked by decisions that are made, hiring decisions that are made, and you're seeing where leadership ends up now. So it's just so complex. Not that, but
one of the things you can actually do if you want to know about it, because we've done it in the past, just bring in a police chief.
Yeah, no. So
they'll bring in his staff, and they will answer because they have in the past all the questions.
No, I did the community police academy, and so there were multiple sessions with their HR folks. And
I mean, I happen to think they do some pretty
actually
good
they do a good
things
job.
over there
Yeah.
so far as reaching out with so far as hiring. I think one of the huge problems that they've had in the past has been retention, people wanting to actually, I don't know what that is now, but people wanting to actually be promoted, because there's a huge difference if you're promoted out of a certain class, because you're not entitled to overtime and all this other stuff. So literally you're losing money because those who stay down there, kind of like the fact that they can pull more money. And that's pretty much it. So people actually not moving forward.
Yeah.
That may have changed.
Promotion piece, yeah.
Yeah, that may have changed under the police officer, but when you look at what he has done so far, and you look at the fact that he's appointed a Black woman as a deputy and everything else, I mean, he is making progress. And again, if you look at their recent recruitment from the people from the academy, I mean, and just look at the annual report, it's
I mean, given the national hiring challenge, no, I think.
But I think if you bring them in, they'll be happy to.
So closing out the loop here, the discussion, Roland, you make a good point about whether it's for you, you're the chair of the. I think it's germane largely to what we do as a commission. A lot of folks would probably like to do it, but we could parse it off.
I think doing it at the commission level makes sense. I literally I think we just need to chat about getting the committee. I mean, I recognize I'm chairman, but I don't know if we sort of reconstitute yet. So I feel like sending it there versus putting it, maybe asking for it to be on the fly. I feel like get it to commission a little faster.
You can do it both.
Yeah.
But don't forget, with the standing committee, you do have the employee input there. And in the past,
Yeah. Do we have employee reps currently?
We do, right?
Okay.
Particularly on the ERG side, that could be helpful. But I still think there could be an exercise.
Yeah.
And then you can.
Yeah.
So are we aligned to see if we can extend an invitation to HR
Mhm.
in July? And I think the topic would be to hear how they're capturing some of this data, how they're responding to some of the physical anomalies in the AAP, and how they're incorporating them.
A quick question on the data. Yeah, I missed it, but this is just static data from the past year, right? Doesn't it show like what the progress was from prior years?
No, and that's one of the issues that I think we've identified tonight, right? Where is the measurement or tracking or monitoring of things like the targeted outreach? Like, did we do it? And if so, how did our data change? And then likewise, just like how did it up or down from your analysis against the what we expect the availability.
Right. We have this, was this person employed by the county last year, the year before,
Yeah.
the year before?
Yeah,
They're all on our website last
Oh,
year,
okay.
AAPs. So
They just don't stack the data year over year. But you can, I mean, or not.
I
It's
think
not a, but you
part
can
of the-
compare them.
Yeah, part of the difference is the applicant pool, right? Like, so it changes. You may have alluded to earlier, and the goals change. But that could be part of it, but we can, I think, maybe the best thing to do is ask Tamara that to get at least our previous year, let's say,
yeah.
this one and the last year, and say, what can you have bandwidth, take a look at the progress with the numbers, or from your look at the numbers, because she has all the data. Does it look like this is a matter of the applicant pool is changing the following year, the demographics change with the pandemic, right, and all the shifts we've had, and now labor market's getting a little easier. So maybe that might have something to do with it. I could definitely follow.
Well, I feel like tracking year over year has to be part of the impact of targeted.
Yeah,
You can't do one without the other. And she seemed to say she's feeling utilized.
Yeah,
And
that was
You
like,
know, she's got her
that
consulting
seemed really
hours.
weird, like, she seemed to say she had lots of time to go to this.
they have a lot of resources, and they have a lot of trainings available. But I think there needs to be a more cohesive, one of the things we've discussed internally is a piece of effort would say HR or having an internal work group, even a pilot, not even countywide, take a job category and maybe work within that, right? It's impacted, see what strategies you can come up with, that would be helpful. We utilize it literally for the AAP, but we are in agreement with her. There's a lot more that can be done. And one of the things is education around the AAP. One of the things that we've talked about internally is at some point having a short training on what is an AAP.
Yes.
Just so people
Everybody needs.
yeah, we have it, and what do people even know where it is? Do they know what it is? Do they know why we do it? And for the first time ever this year, we actually have started doing for the ELT and some departments trainings around how the interplay between the AAP and racial equity. So, which I think departments have found really helpful. There's still a lot of confusion in that area. So if we had a brief, just a 15-minute short training, folks will required to take on what is the AAP, how to go about it, why we do it. I think that would be helpful. Because I think a lot of people, when they think AAP, we talked about that here. I think you saw that here a little, is they focus on numbers. We can't do quotas, but we do have goals. But on the other hand, I think the other pieces that we often miss out on are it's not just diversity. It's, what is your culture? What's the culture of the organization? Are people staying? If they're not staying, why aren't they staying? What are we doing to recruit? What marketing are we doing? If you look at some other organizations and some counties, the kind of marketing they do, it matters what faces you see, right? Do you see people with disabilities on your website? Those are all great ideas that she actually mentioned and we've talked about. It's just, I think we need to put more coordination.
Strategy.
So I think that would be great if it's on the website, because right now you don't see it. It's a very, very old website. Interesting question. Is any of that training mandatory for like department head? Because I would think unbiased, unconscious bias training, I think, is something that should be mandatory for senior management.
I believe it's mandatory for every employee. I don't
Okay.
want to put Anna on the spot, but she would know, me being at the county. Yeah.
Everyone, nobody.
Yeah, because I'm wondering whether or not that is something that the commission should consider.
Yeah.
Recommending, and I mean, something come from us, recommended that be mandatory training for at least the department heads and your senior manager. The layer under that, or maybe even the layer under
Yeah.
that.
And some of the recommendations she had in follow-up, because
Yeah.
it was a really important point. The training isn't.
Yeah, we can take the responsibility, but the training is there.
Yeah, and I
It's just
think,
a matter of someone coming forward and saying, we think you should make it.
and if, well, I
And it
think,
sounds like I mean,
yeah,
but I think this goes back to like, I think, and I'll hammer this home, like, I think HR is the next place to hear from, an overview,
Yeah.
perspective where we can dig in, ask questions, and have an understanding of what we should do. But yeah,
yeah, so actually, to your point, when we, after the very analysis was done, we threw in a couple questions we wanted at the end, and one of those questions our office had asked is, can you please ask employees in your surveys and focus groups, when's the last time they took it? You know, when's the last time they took your training? And to us, the results we got were like, okay, we need a reset. So we were really grateful that, and Mark was, of course, all supportive of it. So he actually sent out an email pushing that forward. And I think we're 8% or something on all employees. So it's definitely mandatory. And I would be very surprised if senior manager.
Because that's the key. I mean, when I was EO director, I set up a training program where even the political appointees, me, had to go through training. Actually, I had to go through training annually.
Right.
That's the key.
Yeah. So it's simply because of their level. I would think that the department heads should go through a lot of training. And it should be recurrent training. There's a lot of things. Some of the things that she was talking about kind of, to me, brought back the barrier analysis. I was just reading that the other day, and some of her remarks that she made sort of coincide with some of the remarks that are in the barrier analysis. So you may want to look at that and have that knowledge when you start looking at that stuff, because obviously there's been a discussion out there among employees, and she hasn't talked to any employees, but her remarks seem to coincide with some. Have actually said it.
And I'd say to build on your point, the prior point about the mandatory nature of training, I think that part of maybe what we distill down, and I think we do this after we hear from HR, right? Have the starting list of, where we may go with a basket of recommendations, but it may be to make mandatory addition to unconscious bias on a periodic basis, that certain people with hiring responsibilities take the basic affirmative action plan training, not this. This is a training for somebody who understands these concepts and who's willing to pull up their sleeves and get it. That's not going to train somebody who's really promoted to a manager position. Understand, what is this? How does it work? What's this availability? I mean, these concepts are not intuitive. The terminology is not intuitive. So I'd love to see a very kind of basic AAP primer that all managers need to take. So they can be thinking about that as they're making these decisions, figuring out where are we going to post this job requisition, right? Because really understanding that is what contextualizes those steps, right? That get to some of the, and I agree with you, I think there are points out of the barrier analysis, applicant outreach, and where are we pulling our people from? Lack of data on, because the paper file issue on experience and education and all of that stuff, all of that tied into our.
I didn't want to ask that. So are there just paper applications for county jobs? I didn't quite understand that point.
No, and I didn't, I may have been thinking of something else. I just remember when we first started working.
Historically, maybe?
Camera, I think historically, it's like, because we only went wholly, I think, online in 2019.
Oh, okay.
Like,
But
we
for
don't,
promotion data.
Yeah.
like, it was like, I remember she had asked about whether we had like educational information folks, and I think at that point it was, and again, it could be confusing, maybe the very analysis folks that were asking for this, and I think part of it was a very big lift. One of the challenges is just resources, right? Even with HR, you might hear that when they come in, it's just the truth, it's just bandwidth. So it was like paper files and who's going through them, and then you're looking for all employees' educational data and uploading it. So it may have been the BA, but I'm sure HR can share more.
And your point about bandwidth. Testimony next year, right? Because a lot of recommendations. Okay.
Maybe one last, I think as powerful as training can be, I think what could be more powerful in addressing some of the issues we saw, or that could be there that we should dig into, is a proper audit of the underlying employment records when there's a potential, which I know is HR, it would not be, it would need to be HR, particular job categories, right? Where, because we talked about, you need to go into the records and see what types of terminations were they. And it's true that you could get that from the data pool, but that's apparently not happening. But it would be interesting to pick one day for HR to pick one job group in which there's a challenge and actually try to dig, because again, training's great, but like there are people making decisions and trying to understand the validity of the hiring decisions or promotion decisions beyond the data is one way of understanding, like, is there a problem in a department or in a team or a hiring manager in particular? And that's, I'm not cameras, I'm not assuming any of that is the case, but I do think that, I think Tamara made this point, going deeper when you see challenges beyond just the top line data. And I know that's time intensive. I'm not saying that's easy, but I think if we could pilot one sort of deep dive and to try to have an understanding of like how did this happen and whether or not how did this disparity happen, I think that would be an interesting part of this work down the line. And I know that's very intensive, but
I would espouse necessary. I mean, we have statistical information. There's a problem. Yeah, it's incumbent on us to look at that issue. And if it's, we've got a data snapshot that we're capturing our data, we actually don't have a problem here. Let's fix that so it doesn't look like we don't, and we got to fix it by figuring out how do we get the right problem. I think it's an absolute imperative. Okay, so the line for invitation for July.
I'll ask them. I'll ask HR.
Perfect.
and
Okay.
I will also chat to get the standing committee
Yeah, we'll
back in fighting.
Okay, so just a couple of things here as we roll through the agenda. On chair update, two key topics. The ordinance went to the board with our advocacy piece. It went out mid-April. We had our last meeting on the 13th of April, so no, it was probably first week of May. It went out. Gone out. Christian acknowledged receipt. I have heard nothing on that since then, but it is in their hands and they are well primed on it. On Monday, the drafting committee reconvenes to work through the kind of parallel work stream, right? The long form, and let's kind of truck through the issues list and start to make, more progress and hay on that. So that's working apace. And then Gurjeet, I know I'm sort of bleeding into your director's report only because Sean's not here. The other thing that's late breaking from last night is we got something from Sean on the quality index. She said he sent us a deck,
Oh, yeah, I wasn't sure what that was for. I'm gonna ask him on that.
and I haven't connected with him in advance. Been waiting to get something from the MEI. Whatever is now in as of yesterday, and I think we need.
Is that the final report?
Well, well, it shouldn't be, no. What we should be getting is a draft score. So I want to clear up a couple of things with the MEI. And that's what I was going to talk about. I don't have any other updates beyond that. But the MEI, we've had a very difficult time, as I've shared before with you guys, in the last 2 years connecting with somebody there. We had a contact. I think they went on sabbatical, and it's been very difficult. So last year we didn't get a draft score at all. I actually looked at my emails. And I think I followed up on them with them 2-3 times saying, hey, we want to, we never had an opportunity to submit information to our raw score because we never got the raw score. So we just got our final. What can we do to correct this? They also missed points on a certain category that we had gotten points for. And I think it was me as the LGBTQ liaison, which is something I know Kellen brought up again. But that's on our website. I think it's on our page. It's unlisted as that. So I think they corrected that. The biggest stickler right now, it seems to be, is benefits for, I think, transgender benefits, which we've sent them, like I want to say a couple of times, but for some reason we don't keep not getting scores for them. And when we reach out, we get a form email back. So that's why I know in the past I've asked if anyone has better contacts, any contacts that will actually respond, let us know. But I don't think that was a score, the draft score. If it was, that's great. If not, we're on track once again to be getting a final without a raw score, first that we can respond to. Because we typically respond in July, right? We send them all our submissions in July and then we get a final in October. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I thought was the.
Yeah,
That's
so
what-
it's just been very difficult.
And on that, do we have any line of sight? That's been languishing up there.
Which, is this the public parks spaces one that was turned into that you guys were okay with? I think where we got to with it was a statement.
Yeah.
A policy statement,
Yeah.
not really a policy, but like, hey, we're not gonna tolerate bullying.
Yeah, it'd be helpful to hear. And if submissions are happening in July, it'd be good to know. I mentioned it in, the budget testimony. Yes, I mentioned it in budget testimony, but when else did I mention it? Oh, on a call with Christian about the ordinance.
Do you have a draft version of that policy you made?
I'll have to dig it up.
And there are outside groups which are taking an interest in this, I think.
Yeah.
Get some.
So maybe we can push that, but Gurjeet, if you could get us is in the process, then we can have one tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, that's all I have on share update. So I have sent around a copy of the April minutes, April meeting minutes, which we did not get to approve in May because we couldn't quorum. Has everybody had a chance to review it? Any questions, concerns, or edits? Motion to approve?
So move.
Opposed? All in favor?
Aye.
No public comments. Gurjeet, MEI covers your report.
Yeah.
Anything else there? Did anybody have any questions on the statistical reports that I think Hannah last week? Okay, no extensions, please?
No.
And then members' reports, obviously, Chris, we're gonna reconvene and get EEO standing committee. Sean is not here today. He'll give us an update on MEI. Anything else from the group? All right, that's it. So we are done at 8:35.
Your next meeting is virtual.
July is virtual?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very
Right.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here. Have those minutes.
If you check your news app,